Hey friends, it's Amy Chappell from Amorini Designs, and today we're here to talk about adding binding to your quilted projects. In the first video in this series, we talked about how to figure out how much binding you need. This is the second video in this series, and we're going to talk about attaching your binding to the front of your quilt sandwich. The next video will go over joining the final two ends of your binding together, and the final video will be all about adding the sewing down the binding to the back of your quilted project. So let's get going. The first thing that you want to do when you are attaching your binding to your quilted project is make sure if you have directional fabric, it's going the direction you want. Typically, I like to make sure that the binding at the top of my quilted project will be right side up, the direction of the fabric. And to test that, I will line up my binding with the bottom of my project, and if my design on my binding is upside down, then I know it will be right side up at the top, so I have it going the direction I want. You'll begin by lining up the edge of your binding well beyond the center point of where you intend your final join to land. I typically like to have it land towards the center or the left of the bottom seam or the left side seam. So I'll make sure I have plenty of fabric there, and then I'm going to put my first pin close to the corner over here, making sure that the raw edges of my binding are lined up with the raw edges of my quilt sandwich. To create the mitered corner, you are going to fold your binding away from your quilt sandwich, making sure that the raw edges of your binding create a straight line with the raw edge of your quilt sandwich. That will give you a nice 45-degree fold in your binding. Then you're going to create a second fold in your binding that is lined up with the edge of your quilt sandwich we've just been working with. So I have my fold right here along this side, and then I'm going to again line up my raw edges of my binding with the raw edge of my quilt sandwich. This is going to make a little triangle flap here that will help us create our beautiful mitered corners. When I am pinning down my binding, I work in a counterclockwise direction so that these flaps are pointing the right direction when I go to sew them down. When I go to sew it down, I will sew it down in a clockwise direction. Typically, I will pin down my binding. If I have joins in my binding and I want to make sure that they are not going to land in the corners where it makes that mitered angle a little bit less flat, or if I'm working with a specific design where I want the colors of my binding to line up with certain places in my project. So if I am working on a small project like this and I don't have any joins in my binding, typically I will take it straight to my machine and not pin it down first. But pinning it down is also a great way to make sure you have plenty of binding and that everything lines up just where you want it. To continue pinning down my binding, I'm going to again make sure my raw edges are all lined up together. I'll put a pin in this side, and then I am going to create my next mitered corner. I find turning my project makes it easier so that I'm always folding the same direction. So again, I'm going to fold away from my quilt sandwich to create this straight line and my nice 45-degree angle. And then I will make my second fold lined up with the edge I've just been working on. And then I will go ahead and put a pin down in that little flap I have just created. Once I have my whole binding pinned down, I will go to my sewing machine, or if I've decided not to pin it down, I will take my binding and my quilt sandwich straight to my machine. And then I'm going to proceed with stitching them down in the same way, whether I've pre-pinned it or I'm just going, adding the binding straight at my machine. So to begin, again, you're going to want to make sure that you're leaving a nice long tail on this side so that you have plenty of fabric to work with when you go to join those final ends. You'll begin stitching a couple of inches away from this corner, and then once you get 1/4 of an inch away from your first edge, you will leave your needle down, lift up your presser foot, and pivot your quilt sandwich and create a little 45-degree stitch in that corner off of the quilt sandwich. You will remove your quilted project from your sewing machine, and I trim those threads, and then you are going to create your mitered corner. So I'm going to show you here, I have drawn with pencil on that little 45-degree angle that I stitch, and then I have taken this off my machine And again, I'm going to create my mitered corner by folding away, lining up my raw edges and making my 45-degree angle. I will fold it back toward my quilt sandwich. Again, making sure that this fold is lined up with this raw edge here. And then I'm going to hold this in place and take it to my sewing machine, where I will start right at the edge, back stitch here, again using my 1/4 inch seam allowance, and sew all the way down my straight edge, lining up all the raw edges until I get, again, a 1/4 inch away from this corner. Now, if my corners have been pinned, I have this little flap here, and I can tell when I'm a 1/4 inch away because I will feel the ridge from my fold for my mitered corner there, and I'll know that's time to leave my needle down, pivot. I will stitch my little 45-degree angle here, pull it off my machine, and then I will unpin that corner. I'm gonna fold my flap the other direction, turn it back to my sewing machine, again, back stitch at the corner and run down until, again, I'm a 1/4 inch away. Once you've gone all the way around your final corner, you want to make sure that you only stitch down, again, a couple of inches to leave yourself a nice long tail to make joining the ends much easier. We'll see you in the next video for how to join our final ends.